Shabbat Shalom. The title of this drash would be Sukkot. What are we preparing for? All of the biblical holidays, the holy days, are listed as Moedim, from Moed, an appointed time, place, or meeting. At these appointed times, places, or meetings, there are various activities. Some are conducted exclusively by the people, some by the Kohanim, the priests, and some by both. Every year, the same rituals are performed over and over again. We have come to understand that these rituals are really rehearsals. They are training us to be prepared for some occurrence that is outside of the Moed itself. In effect, as each appointed time is observed, the people are training themselves to recognize a pattern of what God is doing, so that when the pattern plays out, for real, for what's really going on, for what God is preparing us, we can recognize it. As we consider Sukkot, before we go on, let's pray. Avinu, our Father, you teach us, you show us, you help us to understand, and you expect that we're not simply children, that there is a better level of understanding that we have. And so, Father, I ask that you would grant that to us now, that you would grant us to see and perceive, that there would be revelation, that we would recognize the work that you're doing in Sukkot, that we would be prepared for that work. We do thank you, Father, for how good you are to your people. In Yeshua's name, Amen. So, for us, we have in the different Moedim, I'd like to go through them first here, just so we can see a kind of an idea of what a pattern would be for these different Moedim, the things that are going on. So we start with Passover. It's the first one in the biblical calendar. And that as it's being the first, it is fulfilled in the first coming of Messiah, especially and particularly in his death on the cross. So the pattern for this Moed, for Passover, would be something like, point number 1, the lamb is taken on the 10th of Nisan, and the fulfillment is that Messiah enters the temple in the Passion Week on the 10th of Nisan. Second point is the lamb is examined for the next 5 days. And as you read the Gospels, Messiah is, quote, examined, if you will, by various religious leaders as to his doctrine and his authority during that week. Finally, the lamb is slain on Passover, and Yeshua is executed on Passover, as John relates that to us. So the pattern that we see acted out year after year is fulfilled in Messiah's first coming, his life, and the time up through his death. The next holiday we have is the first fruits, and it plays out very similarly. The pattern is that the first fruits of the harvest are offered up on the day after the Shabbat. The fulfillment in the life of Messiah is that Messiah is raised from the dead on the day after the Shabbat. The fulfillment fits the pattern. It's not exactly the same, but the pattern of it, that's the important thing, is recognizing the pattern of it. Again, Shavuot plays out the same way. The pattern is that the first of the full harvest, God's provision, is offered up. So the fulfillment, first we see this on Shavuot. By tradition, the Torah is given, God's provision, to Moshe on Mount Sinai on Shavuot. On Pentecost, which is also Shavuot, same, just the Greek name or the Hebrew name, according to Acts, the power of God's Spirit is given. Again, this is God's provision to make effective witnesses and disciplers. In each of these Moedim, we see a pattern and a fulfillment. It's all played out, and it's, for us, we should see it. So, since the fulfillment of these holy days is presented to us, since we've already seen Messiah come, we've had the record of it, we can see it as it were with our eyes, the pattern and the fulfillment are relatively easy to see. We unfortunately come to a point sometimes where we ask, how could anyone miss seeing Messiah as the fulfillment? I think we may regret what we say here, because it may not be quite as easy with the fall feasts. They haven't happened yet. But if the spring holy days are patterns of Messiah's first coming, are the fall appointed times to be fulfilled at his return? I mean, that does seem to be the prevalent thought. So since we have this pattern fulfillment typology at work, how might these look? How might the fall feasts look? So we start with Yom Teruah, Rosh Hashanah, the head of the year, the day of blowing, and the pattern is that we have the blowing of the shofarim. Well, the fulfillment, if I want to understand it, is that there is a great shofar that will announce the return of Messiah. That's the common understanding. And it comes from passages like Isaiah 27:13. It will come about also in that day that a great trumpet will be blown, and those who are perishing in the land of Assyria and who were scattered in the land of Egypt will come and worship the Lord in the holy mountain at Jerusalem. This great trumpet call that would gather the people back to Israel. In Zechariah 9:14, then the Lord appeared over them, and his arrow will go forth like lightning, and the Lord God will blow the trumpet and will march in the storms of the south, storm winds of the south. Again, the great trumpet call that will gather and will announce the presence of the Lord and his coming. And then in Matthew 24, Messiah is teaching, and he will send forth his angels with a great trumpet, and they will gather together his elect from the four winds and from one end of the sky to the other. Messiah is teaching about his return, and he quotes these verses. And so we're getting the idea that the Yom Teruah, the Rosh Hashanah, the blowing of the shofarim, applies to Messiah. Paul picks this up in 1 Corinthians 15:52. In a moment, in the twinkling of an eye, at the last trumpet, for the trumpet will sound, again referring back to Isaiah, and the dead will be raised imperishable, and we will be changed. So this whole idea of the trumpet calling and the people raising up and being gathered together. And then in 1 Thessalonians 4:16, for the Lord himself will descend from heaven with a shout, with the voice of the archangel, and with the trumpet of God, and the dead in Christ will rise first. So again, we've got this picture of the blowing of the shofar and the calling of the people and the coming of Messiah all coming together as a pattern and fulfillment at Yom Teruah. So that one seems, that's pretty good. That one we've got. The next one, Yom HaKippurim, we just celebrated Yom Kippur. Well, technically Yom HaKippurim. The pattern elements, the first one is a fast of the people. And perhaps this fasting by the people is a preparation for the judgment. In Matthew 24, actually three sections here in Matthew 24, 32, and 33. Now learn the parable from the fig tree. When its branches has already become tender and put forth its leaves, you know the summer is near. So you too, when you see all these things that are happening around the return of Messiah, recognize that he is near, right at the door, that there is a time that you have to be prepared for, perhaps prepared for judgment. And then Messiah teaches in Matthew 25, then the kingdom of heaven will be compared to 10 virgins who took their lamps and went out to meet the bridegroom. And then you have the whole remaining part of those who were wise and those who were foolish, and those who were prepared and came into the kingdom at judgment. They were judged as wise and prepared. The foolish were not prepared and were not allowed to enter. The idea of being prepared for the judgment. And then in Matthew 25, 31 and 32, but when the Son of Man comes in his glory, and all the angels with him, then he will sit on his glorious throne. All the nations will be gathered before him, and he will separate them from one from another, as a shepherd separates the sheep from the goats. And you go on in that story to hear of those who did it unto the least of the brethren, did it unto him. Again, those who were acting faithfully, who were prepared when the judgment comes, they're ready for it. They are seeing the fig tree ripen, those who were prepared as the virgins, those who had done the work of Messiah, done the work that was appropriate for those who are believers in Messiah. The second pattern part for Yom HaKippurim are all of the ceremonies of the Kohen HaGadol. And that perhaps refers to the work of Messiah in Hebrews 9:11-14. But when Messiah appeared as a high priest of the good things to come, and it relates the story there in these few verses, that Messiah comes and he takes blood, but not the blood of bulls and goats, but his own blood, and he enters into the temple, but not a temple made with man, but the temple that is in heaven. And he enters and does that work. That is a picture of Yom HaKippurim being done in the heavenly temple by Messiah, a work that's separate from us. Just like the Kohen HaGadol does all of his work, and we're oblivious to it year after year. The work of Messiah we only hear about, we don't get to see it, as we do the fasting that we get to participate in. So there are pattern parts and fulfillment parts for Yom HaKippurim that do seem to apply to Messiah on his return. And now our festival, Sukkot. So there's, again, two pattern parts I wanted to pick out. The first one is dwelling in Sukkot. You were commanded to celebrate the festival and to celebrate, to rejoice in it. And the fulfilling of dwelling in Sukkot is perhaps not just having the sukkah, which we're commanded to have, to set up every year, but also the inviting of others into our home. In Leviticus 23:40 and 41. Now on the first day you shall take for yourselves the foliage of beautiful trees, palm branches, boughs of leafy trees, and willows of the brook, and you shall rejoice before the Lord your God for 7 days. You shall thus celebrate it as a feast to the Lord for 7 days. This whole idea of rejoicing and celebrating is not something that we do in isolation. It is something that we are to do as fellowshipping with others, as part of a community. And that rejoicing includes relating of what God has done, of all the goodness that God has given, all sorts of different things. And he commands that we should rejoice and celebrate. And so inviting others into our home, into our sukkah, to feast with us as we plan to do each year, that would be a fulfillment of that dwelling in a sukkah. The second part of the commanded festival of Sukkot that I would like to point out is the offering of the 70 bulls. If you read through what the Kohanim do at the temple, they offer a certain number of bulls on every one of the 7 days. And if you add all of those up, it comes up to 70 bulls. We're going to talk about this a little later more, but it suggests that 70 is the nations, and that it's inviting the nations into the fold, into the family, into the congregation, into the participants of the promises that are given to the nation of Israel. In Zechariah 14:16, then it will come about that any who are left of the nations that went up against Jerusalem will go up from year to year to worship the King, the Lord of hosts, and to celebrate the Feast of Booths, the Feast of Sukkot. So, and we'll talk about this a little later, but all those nations, the 70 nations, will, in this instance here, it's describing in this period, and we'll talk about that, will come before the Lord. And they will come to worship, to enter into his presence, to worship in the temple at that time, and they will worship the King, the Lord of hosts. They will participate in the blessings of the covenant. And then finally, the last of the Torah holidays, the ending of the Torah year in the 7th month. The pattern is the 8th day closing, Shemini Atzeret, the 8th day closing ceremony. And the 8th day is kind of a strange one, and I think we're going to talk about this in our next drash when we talk about Shemini Atzeret. But the fulfillment looks like it's the Olam Haba, the world to come, the universe to come. And in Revelation 21:1, he records for us, John does, then I saw a new heaven and a new earth. All creation dissolves and is reformed into a new heaven and a new earth. For the first heaven and earth passed away, and there was no longer any sea. And he goes on to describe the glory of the new heaven and the new earth. It's not something we really understand, but the important point is that there is a pattern, that there is an 8th day, and that there is something after the time of this world. 8th day is a new beginning. We'll talk about that at next drash. So, we have this typology. Our typology describes the pattern and the fulfillment. We have this typology. We have these rehearsals so that we can recognize and prepare for the work that God is doing. And so we should be ready when we see this rehearsal actually playing out, if you will, for real. Not just the rehearsal. We should be ready to respond and act accordingly. Okay? So when we see, because we're talking about Sukkot, when we see it, we should be able to deal with it. We should be able to respond. But I need to go back to our opening question, because there's something that just isn't quite copacetic yet. What are we preparing for? With Sukkot, what are we preparing for? To give us a little better understanding, let's talk about Sukkot a bit, the biblical and traditional understandings of what's going on in this holiday, this holy day, this moed, this appointed time. Sukkot is a festival that lasts for 7 days. That's explicit. It's a 7-day festival. And then there is an 8th day closing, and you go, well, then it's an 8th day festival, right? No, it's a 7-day festival. Then how do you get an 8th day? Well, that's a wonderful little thing that God just sort of dropped in our laps to say, think about it. Try and figure it out. Just put it in your little noggin to cogitate about it. See if you can come to some understandings. And there are some wonderful understandings. The 8th day is fascinating. But as far as Sukkot goes, the details of it are explained for us, so you're welcome to read them in Leviticus 23 and in Numbers 29. And they enumerate the details for us, the celebrating in the sukkah, the foods that we eat, and then the 70 bulls that are offered up during this time, along with all the attendant offerings that go with them. The 70 bulls is the piece that's important here. So the primary activity for the people is rejoicing and celebrating in their Sukkot. There is one major mitzvah while dwelling in a sukkah. I mean, it doesn't tell us how to do all these things, but there's one that it does say, and that is the arba minim, the 4 species. The people are to rejoice with these: the lulav, the palm branch, an etrog, a citron or lemon, the myrtle branch, and the willow branch. And so there's all sorts of wonderful traditions around how to celebrate with it, how to pray with it, how to rejoice with it. That's the one we're commanded, and so I'd encourage you to practice that, to do that, to enjoy it. It's kind of fun. In addition to this mitzvah, there are a whole host of traditions. One of them includes inviting into our sukkah, inviting the presence of these people. Now, don't go off on reincarnation, don't go off on departed spirits. Just let your mind rest. But we're inviting the 7 patriarchs to come into our sukkah. Avraham, Yitzchak, Yaakov, Yosef, Moshe, Aharon, David. Each of them representing a major aspect of a quality that we as a people should have: compassion, faithfulness, obedience, hearing and obeying God's word, studying God's word, rejoicing before God, all of the things that we do. We invite these men, and I'd encourage you to study it more, but inviting, if you will, the tenor and the quality of their life into our lives. Now, another interesting part, in trying to understand and appreciate and enjoy Sukkot, there are a whole ton of articles that you can read, more than you could ever read, I think, in a lifetime perhaps. I'd like to relate some ideas that were put forth, suggestions for how to think about, how to prepare for, and how to enjoy the festival of Sukkot. This came from an article by My Jewish Learning, and it's 7 reasons for Sukkah sitting. And I don't know if reasons is the right word, maybe meditations, if you will, thoughts and ideas. The first one is the thanksgiving for the harvest, and it relates from Exodus 23:16 and Deuteronomy 16:13, the abundance of God's blessing. that God provides, and that there should be thanksgiving and a heart of thanksgiving and gratitude for all that God provides. Second one, that there is this historical connection to our ancestors and to God from Leviticus 23 verses 42 and 43. And it relates that Sukkot and the dwelling in it and the relating it from one generation to the next generation implies that there is a connection both to past generations all the way back to the patriarchs and a connection to future generations, that this is a generational feast, a generational time of rejoicing, and that all of those things that we do are not just for us, not just for today, but they are for our connection to the past and our hopefully godly inheritance that we would pass on to our children and next generations. This is an interesting one. This is they described it as remembering the bad old days. Okay, and they suggested that this came from an author named Philo, entitled On Special Laws. They referenced the section there. And it's really a remembering of where we were in the past, where we came from. That in the past we were in desperate straits, and we were in trouble, and we were struggling. And God brought us out of those things. And God has blessed us. And we don't want to forget the bad old days. Because that might diminish how grateful we are for what God has done. So we remember, we don't dwell there. We don't dwell in the past. But we remember that there were these bad old days that God brought us out. The next one is a lesson in humility. And it records for us from Deuteronomy 8:17 and 18 that all of the abundance that God gives us, that we are grateful for, that we rejoice in, that we enjoy, that we, the great feasts that we have, we're reminded it is not from our power. It's not how great we are, how wonderful our intellect, how wonderful our strength, our ingenuity, our energy. It's not those things. It's not thinking about ourself and therefore thinking less of ourselves, like C.S. Lewis records. Humility is not thinking less of yourself, but thinking of yourself less. It's thinking more about God, remembering that He is the one that gave us the power and the ability to do anything that was accomplished, giving Him gratitude and thanks. Next, the idea of increasing our faith. And this is a reference that I was not familiar with, so Rabbi Avov and Menarat Ha'amor, you can read the reference there, but he suggests that the frailty of our sukkah reminds us that we are to trust in God and not in our homes, our houses, and then by extension in other people. It is the case that we dwell in these frail structures. The sukkah is frail. Even our well-built homes are frail. If you look at a dilapidated castle from hundreds of years ago, it's frail. It survived for so long, but it's frail. It deteriorates. People are frail. And we don't trust in anything except God. We have faith in God because He is permanent. The next point they offered that we could meditate on was universal brotherhood. And they quote from Rabbi Samson Raphael Hirsch, "The sukkah is a symbol of peace and brotherhood. Peace because we as the children of Israel dwelt under God's sukkah and they were protected there, that there were no troubles for them, that He kept them safe. It was a guard about them, and that by inviting everyone in, it was a brotherhood." And so by dwelling in a sukkah, it's a reminder of the symbol of peace and brotherhood, and that we are all invited. And it sure looks like those are firefighters, a brotherhood of firefighters who are caring for one another, watching out for one another. And that's a good picture for us. Lastly, they suggest that we're to remember the less fortunate. Taking from several of the earlier ideas, since all we have is from God, and it's not just for us to consume, it is for His purposes. right? He is the one who gave it, so it's really for his purposes, even though we get to enjoy it. It's for his purposes, and his purposes extend not just to us. He cares for us, he provides for us, but that is not the full extent of what he wants. It is to go beyond that. In the plan of redemption, it is to bring in those who are less fortunate, those who are struggling. And so it is a time to remember the less fortunate. So some of those ideas help us to get a better feel for what Sukkot is about and what dwelling in the sukkah is for us. There is no temple now, so we cannot offer the 70 bulls. But the part of Sukkot that is dwelling in the sukkah, with these meditation thoughts, if you will, and a whole bunch of others, are good for us. Now, I'd also like to consider that there are parallels, to help us understand Sukkot a little bit, there are parallels with Pesach, Passover. And the fact that there are these commonalities and differences suggests that that would be instructive for us. Where they're the same, we go, oh, I wonder why they're the same. What does that teach us about both of them? And where they're different, what does that teach us about both of them? So again, Pesach and Sukkot last for a week. Literally, it's not a week. It's not from Shabbat to Shabbat. It's really 7 days, from the 15th to the 22nd of each month. It's the exact days of the month. They just happen at a different time. And being that it's a full week, and we remember the week of creation, that everything started and ended within a week, that picture suggests a fullness or a completeness. The picture that Pesach and Sukkot last for 7 days, like the 7 days of creation, suggests that that's a complete lifetime. A lifetime of our life's work and a lifetime of the life of this earth. That 7 days, that rings for us. That's the same, and it reminds us of creation, and it goes from there. Again, it's from the 15th to the 22nd. Pesach in the first month. So that suggests, first month suggests that's the start of things. And that the lifetime, there are things in Pesach, in Passover, that relate to our entire life, but they occur in that first month. But they should remind us of things that go on in our life. The ideas of bondage to sin, of being set free from the life of bondage, being set free from sin, of walking in righteousness, the hagamatza, that we do not eat leaven, the picture Paul gives us of sin. We don't consume that during our lifetime. And then Sukkot, again, 7 days, reminds us of 7 days of creation, a lifetime. So there are pictures in Sukkot that should span our entire life also. And it happens in the 7th month, which is actually the final month of the Torah year. It doesn't have a discussion about an 8, 9, 10, however many months. It goes from 1 to 7, and then you just pause, start over at the first. And so in Sukkot, there are things that should last for our entire lifetime. And we talked about some of those things just a little bit ago in those meditations. Pesach pictures the start of our life, the covenant, the salvation, entering into the work, and then the summer, when all of those things that are prepared work out in the fruition of growing and maturing and bringing in. Sukkot pictures then the completion, the harvest, the fullness, the final maturity. All of the work that was begun at Pesach, grown through the summer, is harvested and brought in at Sukkot, and we rejoice in it. So the work of Pesach, the work of Sukkot overlap each other. They talk about different aspects of our life, but they cover our entire lifetime. Now, there is one more picture of this Pesach Sukkot thing. And they both last for 7 days. Like the days of the earth, the days of creation, created in 7 days. And leading to the thought that the lifespan of the earth, the Olam Hazeh, the world that is, would be 7,000 years. Okay? So this you piece together. In Psalms 90 verse 4, it says, "For 1,000 years in your sight are like yesterday when it passes by, or as a watch in the night." 2 Peter 3:8, he relates to us the fact that by the time that he was taught the scriptures and the understanding of them, he says, "But do not let this one fact escape your notice, beloved, that with the Lord 1 day is like 1,000 years, and 1,000 years like 1 day." he picks up on this passage and the common understanding that had been developed in all the time between when the Psalms was written and when Peter walked the earth, and what he had been taught and what he had learned and understood, which is true by the Spirit teaching him, is that there is this correlation between 1,000 years and a day. Peter goes on to use that to say God is not slack in fulfilling his promises, but it lays out for us the idea that there is perhaps a 7-day creation and a 7,000-year life of the world. In Sanhedrin 97a, let me read it for you. This is just a couple paragraphs. Rabbi Katina said, 6,000 years shall the world exist, and 1,000, the seventh, it shall be desolate, as it is written, and the Lord alone shall be exalted in that day. Abaya says, it will be desolate 2,000 years, as it is said, after 2 days he will revive us. In the 3rd day he will raise us up. That's from Hosea, he's quoting. And we shall live in his sight. It has been taught in accordance with Rabbi Katina, just as the 7th year is 1 year of release in 7, so is the world. 1,000 years out of 7 shall be fallow, resting. The idea of resting is important because that's a Shabbat. It's the 7th day rest. As it is written, the Lord alone shall be exalted in that day. And it is further said, a psalm and a song for the Sabbath day, meaning the day that is altogether Sabbath. And it is also said, for 1,000 years in your sight are as but yesterday, when it is past. And that's again referring back to Psalms 94. Finally then, in Avodah Zarah 9a, it records just a short section here. The Tana, Deba Eliyahu, said, the world is to exist for 6,000 years. The first 2,000 years are to be void. That would be the time from Adam up to Avraham, a time without Torah, a time without God's teaching. The next 2,000 years are a period of Torah, from that which God spoke to and taught Avraham until it was fully revealed through Moshe up to the time of Messiah is the time that the Torah was being taught and spread throughout the world. The following 2,000 years are the period of Messiah. Isn't that fascinating? It's from the days of Messiah 2,000 years ago up through our day. He then laments, through our many sins, a number of these have already passed. The first 2,000, the second 2,000, and Messiah is not yet. But he missed it because Messiah was. He wrote this during the period of the Messiah, and he didn't recognize Messiah. But he knew that they were looking for the Messiah to come when Messiah came. Paul says it was in the fullness of time at just the right time, and this is what they were speaking to, I think. So this lays out for us a period of 7,000 years for the earth. 2 for a void without Torah. Chaos is sometimes called. 2 days, 2,000 years for Torah. 2 days, 2,000 years for the period of Messiah. And the final one, a Shabbat rest. Now, in classic Christian eschatology, that 7th day, the Shabbat of the earth, if you will, the 7th 1,000 years matches up to the 1,000-year reign of Messiah. This is described for us in Revelation 20. At the culmination of this present age, this would be the 7th day of creation, the 7th 1,000 years of this world's age. And so I'm going to pick it up at Revelation 19, verse 17, where it's recording the final battle where the enemy and all of his hosts are destroyed. Then I saw an angel standing in the sun, and he cried out with a loud voice, saying, to all the birds which fly in mid-heaven, come, assemble, for the great supper of God, so that you may eat the flesh of kings, and the flesh of commanders, and the flesh of mighty men, and the flesh of horses, and of those who sit on them, and of the flesh of all men, both free men and slaves, and small and great. And I saw the beast, and the kings of the earth, and their armies assembled to make war against him who sat on the horse, and against his army. And the beast was seized, and with him the false prophet who performed the signs in his presence, by which he deceived those who had received the mark of the beast, and those who had worshipped his image. These 2 were thrown alive into the lake of fire, which burns with brimstone. And the rest were killed with the sword which came out of the mouth of him who sat on the horse, Mashiach. And all the birds were filled with their flesh. So there is this great war of those who came against Messiah at Jerusalem, and they are defeated. And then in Revelation 20, verse 1, it picks right up. And then I saw an angel coming down from heaven, holding the key to the abyss, and a great chain in his hand. And he laid hold of the dragon, the serpent of old, who is the devil and Hasatan, and bound him for 1,000 years. There will be 1,000 years of peace, for Hasatan is not causing trouble. And then he threw him into the abyss and shut it and sealed it over him, that he would not deceive the nations any longer, until the 1,000 years were completed. After these things he must be released for a short time. Then I saw thrones, and they sat on them, and judgment was given to them. And I saw the souls of those who had been beheaded because of their testimony of Yeshua, because of the word of God, and those who had not worshipped the beast or his image, and had not received the mark on their forehead or on their hand. And they came to life and reigned with Messiah for 1,000 years. The rest of the dead did not come to life until the 1,000 years were completed. This is the first resurrection. Blessed and holy is the one who has a part in the first resurrection. Over these the second death has no power, but they will be priests of God and of Messiah, and will reign with him for 1,000 years. The millennium, the Sabbath of rest, when Hasatan is bound and no longer a cause of trouble for us. This is a time of reigning. Now, lest you think that John made this up on his own, it sounds very much like Zechariah 14, verses 16 to 19. Here's part of it, but let me read the entire passage here. It's just 4 verses. Then it came about that any of those who were left of all the nations that went up against Jerusalem will go up from year to year to worship the king. Okay, this is that war that he just described in the book of the Revelation, he's referencing here. And those who are left now during the reign of Messiah, those who are left of the nations that went up against Jerusalem, they will come from year to year to worship the King, the Lord of hosts, and to celebrate the Feast of Booths, Sukkot. Sukkot will be celebrated during the millennial reign. And it will be that whichever of the families of the earth does not go up to Jerusalem to worship the King, does not participate in the covenant with the Lord of hosts, there will be no rain, no blessing from God on them. And if the family of Egypt does not go up, there will be no rain on them. And it will be a plague with which the Lord smites the nations that do not go up to celebrate the Feast of Booths, to celebrate Sukkot, because Sukkot is so much the culmination of all these things. This will be the punishment on Egypt and the punishment on all of the nations who do not go up to celebrate the Feast of Booths of Sukkot. This 1,000-year reign. This is a fascinating part of what Sukkot is about, that it is a picture of that time of reigning. It's a picture of those things now, but it pictures that time. So that's something we need to remember and understand about Sukkot. There's another aspect. The 70 bulls that are offered during the Sukkot are a clarion reminder. It's a clear call, a clarion reminder of the 70 nations. And this is based on the 70 sons of Israel. In the sacrificial system, a bull is required offering for the Kohen Hagadol. If he sins, it is a bull that is offered. Or if the entire nation sins. The entire nation is represented by a bull. So let's go through the pieces of this. I want to lay them out for you. But this suggests that all of the nations are included during the festival of Sukkot and invited in to the Commonwealth of Israel, are invited to participate. So here's the pieces and parts. In Exodus 1:5, all the persons who came out of the loins of Jacob were 70 in number, but Joseph was already in Egypt. Okay, so there you've got 70. Deuteronomy 10:22 reminds us of this, repeats that. Your fathers went down to Egypt 70 persons in all. The number of the sons of Israel, 70 persons. Now the Lord your God has made you as numerous as the stars of heaven. So that goes beyond that. But it starts with the 70. And then, when the Most High gave the nations their inheritance, when he separated the sons of men, he set the boundaries of the peoples, he set the boundaries of the nations, according to the number of the sons of Israel. How many sons of Israel? 70. How many nations? 70. And then in Leviticus 4:13 and 14, now if the whole congregation of Israel commits an error, and the matter escapes the notice of the assembly, and they commit any of the things which the Lord has commanded them not to be done, and they become guilty, when the sin which they have committed becomes known, Then the assembly shall offer a bull of the herd for a sin offering, and bring it before the tent of meeting. If the entire nation is in sin, the sacrifice is a bull. How many bulls are sacrificed at Sukkot? 70. How many nations are there? 70. It is a picture that during Sukkot, all of the nations are invited in. So in summary, Sukkot, the festival of booths, has both immediate and eschatological understanding. Immediate now, eschatological the end of things. In the immediate, we have the issue and practice of hospitality, inviting others into our sukkah, into the fellowship with our family, to dwell, to be comforted, and to be blessed. Co-joined, concurrently with that, at the same time, is the idea of evangelism and discipleship, inviting others into our sukkah, that is, our community of faith, not just our family to be there temporarily, but into our community of faith. It is the idea of bringing people in, inviting them in, and then discipling them that they can participate in the community of faith. Those are all explained and brought into the ideas of Sukkot. In eschatology, remember we have immediate and eschatological. In eschatology, the end of things, we have the millennial reign of Messiah. And this entails a whole lot of speculation, which I am not qualified to entertain with you now. So we're not going to go there, other than to say this is a fact that is attested to both in the Tanakh as well as in all the apostolic writings. There will be this reign of Messiah. And that has something for us, something important for us. And so I want to pick up on that, somewhat in the next one on Shemini Atzeret, because we're going to also talk about the new heavens and the new earth then. But I want to go back to our opening question. With Sukkot, what are we preparing for? What are we rehearsing for? That's the question we started with. Why? What is this about Sukkot? What are we preparing for? Now the easy answer would be that we're rehearsing hospitality, evangelism, and discipleship. Those are the things of Sukkot. That's what we prepare for. But the thing of it is, if these rehearsals are to prepare us for the work that Adonai is doing in the fulfillment of each moed, these rehearsals, all of them, all 7, right? Starting with Pesach, going through Shemini Atzeret, each of these moed, each of these appointed times, what do we see of Messiah and the work of Adonai in these rehearsals? What do we see? You remember at the beginning, we mildly chided the past generations for not recognizing the coming. How could anyone not see Messiah in the fulfillment of the spring feast, in his life, death, resurrection, the outpouring of the Spirit? How could it be that anyone would miss that? How could it be? Poor little guy tries to think on it, he doesn't get it. Well, we chided them, so now it's our chance. See if we can do a better job of getting it with the rehearsals of the fall feast. We've got all of the patterns laid out there for us. Do we get it? Can we recognize and identify all of the fall feasts when they happen? Or, well, just a minute. Do you think it would be difficult to recognize the return of Messiah when that horse comes in the clouds, and him who sits on the horse, and the sword that comes out of his mouth, and the legion of army all coming after him? Do you think it's going to be hard to see that? Or to identify the time of Jacob's trouble when Israel is in desperate straits, attacked on every side? Do you think it's going to be hard to see that? Is it going to be hard to recognize and identify the time of Messiah's judgment when people are called to the throne and they are judged there? Is that going to be, we're going to guess, is this it or not? And what about identifying the millennial reign when Hasatan is taken away and Messiah sets up his kingdom and his capital is in Jerusalem? Are we going to have a hard time saying, well, is this the time? I don't think this is a forest and trees thing. I think this is going to be real easy for us to see. So it seems that with the spring feasts, we were supposed to try and figure out, could we recognize and identify Messiah and the work that God is doing as we look at the things that are happening and the pattern. It doesn't seem to work in the fall feasts. It seems that our participation in the topology of pattern and fulfillment doesn't line up too well with the idea of recognize and identify. In the spring, it was recognize and identify Messiah, his work. Recognize and identify. Do you see him? Do you see him? Do you see him? But that action on our part doesn't fit. It fits the spring feast, but it doesn't seem to fit the fall feasts. For the fall feasts, recognize and identify just doesn't line up because it's so easy to identify them. Even now, looking forward to those things, when Messiah returns, every eye will see him. Okay, it's easy, done. It's not something hard. It feels like our participation is going to be different. Perhaps the topology issue for the fall appointed times is not one of recognition, but rather our participation is that we are to train ourselves from the rehearsals, going through all these things, earnestly training ourselves, that we can endure the trials, the troubles, the stresses and difficulties of this, if you will, the Erev Shabbat of the world that is, the Olam Hazeh. The fall feast is not training us so that we can recognize Messiah, but it's training us to be faithful when this time does happen so that we can continue on. Instead of trying to figure out how to recognize and identify the timing and sequence of the fall feasts, perhaps what the topology is showing us, what the topology rehearsals are trying to do, is to ingrain the godly patterns in our lives of what these feasts bring about, what they teach us. Those patterns, preparing for the judgment and all of the things that we've talked about in Sukkot, preparing us so that we can remain faithful when those times do come. Instead of the recognize and identify of the spring feasts as our part in the training, our part in the fall feasts is to train ourselves by practicing the Moedim and practicing all the parts of them, that when they occur we are prepared to continue in hospitality, evangelism, and discipleship, that the troubles of this end times do not throw us off the tracks and we stop. We bring ourselves together and we stop doing hospitality, we stop evangelism, we stop disciples. No, we're prepared because we've been training ourselves. We're prepared to continue. We continue to be faithful, to humble ourselves and trust in God despite the maelstrom of trouble. We don't let all the troubles of this end time distract us. We remain humble and faithful to God, to trust in Him. And we're perseverant in cooperating with Adonai, that He could do in us and through us, that His will might be done, His good pleasure would be done in us, that we continue to persevere in difficult times. Our part is not trying to identify the return of Messiah. Our part is to prepare us to be faithful, that we could persevere through this time. So, our question, what are we preparing for? What is it in Sukkot that we're preparing for? What have we been talking about? We are preparing for the most amazing and spectacular Erev Shabbat ever. The lighting of the candles, the blessings, Shalom Aleichem, Kiddush, all this and more. And we want Messiah to be able to respond yes to the question that he asked in Luke 18:8. I tell you that he, Messiah, will bring about justice for them quickly. However, Messiah asks, when the Son of Man comes, will he find faith on the earth? Our participation in the topology of pattern and fulfillment of the fall feasts is so that we would be able to remain faithful. May you be fully prepared on the day of his return, that we might say with the author of the book of the Revelation, in Revelation 22:20, the one who is testifying to these things says, yes, I am coming soon. Amen. Come, Lord Yeshua. Chag Sameach. Chag Sukkot Sameach.